Okay, so hi everyone. Today we have Jordan Harrod here with us. Jordan Harrod is a PhD student in medical engineering and medical physics at the Harvard MIT Health Sciences and Technology program. Her research focuses on neuromodulation to understand pain and consciousness, and using neurotechnology and machine learning to develop new tools for brain stimulation. Outside of the lab, she makes incredible educational videos about artificial intelligence on our YouTube channel, and she also advocates for evidence-based policy for AI. I'd highly recommend watching her insightful videos, and I binge watched many of them myself to better explore how we interact with AI, algorithms, and other new technology every day. So welcome, Jordan. We're so happy you're here and you can take it away.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I will pull up some slides once I figure out which tab I put them in. There it is. And so this is going to be like pretty casual, so feel free to like drop questions in, let's see, not the chat. Oh, there we go. Yeah, feel free to drop questions in the chat, or I can answer questions at the end, whatever works best for people. But yeah, so hi, I'm Jordan. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm a PhD student and YouTuber, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my journey through science, how I ended up doing a PhD, and things that I generally wish I'd known as I went through the process that hopefully will be helpful to any of you who are interested in following a similar track or just going through the minefield that is academia yourselves. So in terms of things I do, you can see a list here. I tend to work with brain simulation mouse models. I also work with machine learning for neuroimaging and control systems. I build non-invasive brain stimulation devices, and then outside of lab, I make YouTube videos. I'm involved in student government. And pre-COVID, I was more involved in sports, and currently I'm hoping to start to get back into that as I get my second Pfizer shot next week and get back to being around people, fingers crossed. And so the first thing I kind of like to hit on whenever I do presentations like this is like whether or not I actually wanted to do a PhD the whole time, because I feel like a lot of people who are interested in pursuing graduate degrees often, had parents who were professors or otherwise were like pretty connected to academia growing up. And so they had a better understanding of the career path than people who just aren't exposed to that growing up as much. And while my parents did have graduate degrees, my mom had a master's in English and my dad has an MBA, I didn't really have a great concept of what a PhD was until undergrad, and even before that didn't necessarily have a great concept of, what research is, which I'll have a funny story for a little bit later in this talk. But the short answer to this question is essentially no. I was always medically inclined. So I was interested in being a doctor for a while. I then started watching too much of the series Bones and thought that I would be a forensic anthropologist, which I then later learned was basically a mortician, which you could like only get jobs for in the Midwest and like cold basements and not really get paid very well. So I backed away from that. My mom's an English teacher, so then I thought maybe I'd do something related to teaching medicine or teaching something about science. Then I went back to thinking about being a doctor when I got to my undergrad. So I was pre-med initially. Well, I guess I was pre-med the whole time. I just didn't apply to med school. And once I got to my undergrad, ended up majoring in biomedical engineering, took kind of a quick detour into machine learning for medical imaging, and thought that I might go heavier into the computer science side of things, and then ended up where I am now, which is essentially kind of the engineering plus YouTube space. And I should say that I feel like people often look at, people in STEM grad programs or people who are working in science professionally and think that you always had to be inclined towards something like that. You were the kid taking all of the like STEM classes in high school and stuff like that. And while I did take some science classes in high school, most of my time was actually spent being a student athlete. I was a 8-season varsity athlete for my high school. And I'm still super involved in fitness on top of that, which is just to say you can have a lot of interests. You can pursue multiple interests at the same time. And in particular, like if it turns out that you're interested in science, even though you came from more of an athletic or otherwise what is often called non-traditional, even though everyone comes on their own unique journey to science background, you can still end up doing science. So in terms of slightly more specific details on how I ended up where I am now, I'm actually, I guess, missing one thing from this, which I just realized. So I grew up in Northern Jersey in a town called Montclair, which is the star up here. And my high school actually had a program called the Weston Science Scholars Program, which allowed you to do research, work on a research project in a lab at Montclair State University, which was the local university in my town. And I spent a summer doing that. I actually worked in environmental sciences. So we were interested in looking at the effects of basically toxic runoff on different algae that were in local lakes. And I think I had an interesting time there, but I didn't quite grasp what research was, especially because it turned out that the project that I'd been assigned with someone else was actually a project that another undergrad in that lab had already completed. And so part of the reason why they gave it to us was because they knew what the outcome was going to be. And it felt like, the experiments that you do in high school where they kind of walk you through, or even in like Gen Chem lab in college, where they basically walk you through like exactly what has to happen and you know what's going to happen at the end. And if that was what research was, that wasn't really super interesting to me. However, I had the opportunity to work in a lab at Columbia. I worked in Helen Liu's lab, which is the biomaterials and interface tissue engineering lab. Funny story, I met with her for the first time as a high school student during, I believe, the beginning of my senior year. And when she asked me if I was interested in doing research, I said no, I was interested in doing experiments because I thought that research was like writing a paper on something, like Googling a bunch of stuff and then like writing a paper summarizing it, and didn't really realize what actually goes into like scientific research. So for some reason, she still let me into her lab, God knows why. But I ended up working with her for about a year. My high school had a program called Senior Option that essentially meant when you got to I believe it was the beginning of your second semester of senior year. If you'd completed all of your graduation requirements, you could take the last 2 months essentially off from school to pursue some sort of outside project. And so the outside project that I pursued during that period was working with her, which was a great experience for me. It kind of got me interested in biomaterials and ended up being useful for when I did my undergrad at Cornell. So I went to Cornell. I actually didn't fully know what I was going to study when I got there because Cornell didn't have a biomedical engineering program when I applied. So I thought that I might do bioengineering or I might do electrical engineering and maybe minor in something else to get the medical side of things. And I was still interested in doing research that was somewhat similar to what I did at Columbia in terms of working on biomaterials. But in particular, I was actually interested in like sports medicine research, which tied back into my history of athletics. I've had every orthopedic injury known to man at this point because I do too many sports. And so in particular, I have a partially herniated disc in my lower back, and I was interested in the work that a lab was doing on intervertebral disc engineering. Unfortunately, I don't have pictures here. I actually should include that in future presentations, but we basically have a 3D printer that prints living cells that turn into like collagen, and you can use that to print different like bone and collagen structures that can be customized towards the specific person. So I was interested in doing something like that. That particular project didn't have openings, but I ended up working on a different project in that lab. I worked on essentially doing the same thing, but with the enthesis, which is the structure that basically connects the meniscus, which is the load-bearing structure in your knee, to the actual bone, and is the thing that kind of keeps those menisci actually in your knee instead of just sliding out. So that was a great project that I worked on for 3 years. But while I was there, I also interned. I spent a summer at Novartis. So I thought originally when I came into undergrad that I was going to go into pharma right after. I actually wasn't planning on going to grad school. And then I spent a summer working in what was essentially an entry-level position at Novartis. and realized that it wasn't exactly what I was interested in doing, partially because I worked there during a summer when they'd just gotten something, a new therapeutic through the FDA pipeline. And I realized that what happens when something gets approved is that everyone who's like entry level in R&D gets like laid off, and they hire a ton of people in marketing. And so within like first 2 weeks of me working there, I think like 2/3 of R&D got laid off and a ton of people came in on the marketing side. And it just didn't really seem like that was the kind of job that I was interested in. And the people who stayed were people with PhDs. And they were also the people who got to have kind of intellectual ownership over the projects that they worked on, which was the other thing that I kind of realized that I didn't really like about working in industry at the time. I liked the fact that when I did research projects at Cornell, I kind of owned the whole project, which let me come up with new ideas, forced me to learn new skills, and helped me answer questions that I thought were interesting versus kind of being handed a pile of data, and being told what to do with it. So after that, I did a summer research program the next summer at Stanford. I did the Stanford Amgen Scholars Program, which is a great program. I highly recommend applying to it. Essentially, it's, I believe, a 10-week program. They pay you to do research for that entire 10 weeks. You get like food, housing, everything's included. There was also GRE prep, and you meet with the Dean of Biosciences, who basically looks over all of your application materials and your letters of rec from the people who wrote your letters for the program and gives you feedback on all of them, which is an interesting experience to have someone be like, you should tell your letter writer, the professor that you work with, that like they should do this different thing in your letter of recommendation going forward. Like, I'm not going to do that, but that was a great experience in terms of seeing other places and getting exposed to new research, in particular machine learning research. So I hadn't had a background in machine learning before this. I had a background in medical image analysis and data science from both my work at Cornell in that lab that I was working in and my work at Novartis. I was working on clinical data analytics for them. And I got an email essentially a week before I was supposed to fly out to California, saying that I'd be working on a machine learning project and basically telling me what I need to know by the time I got there, which essentially required me to kind of pick up intro machine learning in a week, which I did, and which was interesting. And that was a great experience in terms of getting into machine learning. As I'll talk about a little bit later, I think one of my initial takeaways from that was that I wasn't necessarily interested in machine learning. I ended up changing my mind about that later on. But by the end of my 4 years at Cornell, I did figure out that I was interested in doing something that tied electrical engineering, computer science to medicine. So I'd majored in biomedical engineering. Cornell created a biomedical engineering major while I was a sophomore there. And so I was part of the first class to move through that program, which was great because it gave me a lot of flexibility, but also weird because you end up like being a bit of a test dummy for new classes and new professors, which is always an interesting scenario to be in, and ended up applying to grad school. And I'm actually going to skip a couple slides because I forgot that I included more detailed slides on this. Cool, yeah. So I took a bunch of classes on biomedical circuit development and got interested in device development. So this was a picture from one of my labs where I was building an EKG to use on myself, which I later found out that kids in the electrical engineering program weren't allowed to do because of the risk of potentially shocking themselves. And yet our professor let us do that, which questionable in hindsight, but I love the class. And so yeah, by the time that I was applying to PhD programs, I figured out that I wanted to work on ECS for medicine, probably neuroscience. I wasn't wedded to neuro, but I looked at what was kind of going on in the research area of that, and brain-machine interface work was essentially the most interesting thing to me at the time. And I also realized that while the experience that I had that summer at Stanford wasn't my favorite, a lot of it was because my lab actually worked fully remotely. So I think I met my advisor twice. I didn't really have a lab community to be around, so I kind of found myself like alone in different libraries on campus for 10 straight weeks, and didn't really have a ton of mentorship. And so I reevaluated once I took a course that involved more machine learning and decided that it was something that I would at least be interested in including in my graduate work. And I applied to a bunch of different programs. I can talk a little bit more specifically about that if people have questions about that, but I'm not going to dive too far into like the actual admissions process. So I'll skip forward to say that I'm now in a PhD program. I'm a third year in the medical engineering and medical physics PhD program through the Harvard MIT Health Sciences and Technology program, which is a mouthful. It's a program that's jointly run by MIT and Harvard Medical School. So the PhD students take medical school coursework with the MD students, as well as fundamentals engineering coursework. So you can concentrate in different fields. My concentration is in computer science. I think that was definitely the best of both worlds when it came to a program for me, because I was still interested in medicine. I still wanted to have access to the clinic, but I wasn't interested in getting a medical degree. I was interested in practicing medicine. And so this program really lets me kind of be in the clinic, be close to the clinic, have my research tied directly to the clinic without actually being the person doing the medicine. The other nice thing about HST was that we can essentially work with anyone who has a Harvard or MIT affiliation in the Boston area, which is basically everyone at most major institutions in the Boston area. So you get a lot of options for research. And as someone who wasn't entirely sure what you wanted to do, the flexibility was really appealing. So the way that our rotations work, our first year, you essentially don't join the program in a lab, you join the program as a student, and then you get to try out a bunch of different labs and different rotations before you pick your advisor or advisors, as is my position, and figure out what your research project is going to be. And also happy to answer more detailed questions on stuff like that. So now I am actually co-advised, which I'll talk about in a second. And I guess this slide is more accurate pre-COVID. But in general, I used to split my time 3 ways. So about a third of my time was spent doing behavioral work in mice. Another third was spent working on brain stimulation devices. A lot of that right now is more in the modeling realm than in the hardware development realm. And then a third that was spent looking at machine learning systems for control, as well as for analyzing data from some other projects that other people are working in the lab. So I always include this slide because this just looks cool. I don't work on this. This is a project out of one of my labs that looks at fluorescent microscopy for brain imaging that lets you stain things 8 billion different colors so you can get like higher resolution images that make it easier to see what things are in brain tissue. And I just think it looks cool. So as I mentioned, I'm co-advised. This logo is actually out of date, but we don't have a new logo yet, so I'm going to leave it. And I work between the Neuroscience Statistics Research Laboratory and the Synthetic Neurobiology Group. So the NSRL is led by Emery Brown. He is actually also the co-director of my program, and he's an MD PhD. So he did his PhD in statistics at Harvard and his MD at Harvard, or he did his PhD in statistics at Harvard College and his MD at Harvard Medical. And he is a practicing anesthesiologist. So on Tuesdays, he's like in the operating room doing surgeries. In fact, there was a student a few years ago who had their appendix rupture. And as they're being wheeled into the OR, they look up and like my advisors, they're anesthesiologists. So that's something I'm hoping I never have to deal with because that seems like it would be uncomfortable. But essentially our lab works on better understanding the mechanisms behind anesthesia, as well as modeling neuroscience phenomena using statistics. My other advisor is Ed Boyden. So he runs the Synthetic Neurobiology Group. He is formally affiliated with the Media Lab at MIT. The lab used to be affiliated with the Media Lab and is now fully part of Brain and Cognitive Sciences, which is our neuroscience department. And our lab essentially works on neuromethods. So Ed's lab doesn't do basic science research as a general rule. Instead, we develop tools that help us, as he says, watch, map, and perturb the brain. So that can be anything from designing new fluorescent reporters for brain imaging to doing things like expansion microscopy to developing systems like the temporal interference brain stimulation system that we published a paper on in 2017 that is in theory a way of doing deep brain stimulation non-invasively in people. And so between the two of them, I essentially develop methods in Ed's lab to apply them to issues in Emery's lab. And I'm not going to get actually too deep into that because a lot of my research is confidential because it's unpublished. But we're essentially interested in developing systems that let us both probe the brain to better understand pain, consciousness, anesthesia, and also developing systems that are clinically translatable. So things that we can also, in theory, eventually use in people. And so this is what I'm doing now. I'm a third year. I'm thinking that at the moment I'll probably be here for another 2 to 3 years, probably 3 years because of COVID, but we'll see. But one thing I want to note is that just because this is what I'm doing now doesn't mean that it's what I'm going to do in the future. I don't necessarily know what I want to do in the future. And so in particular, like your PhD research, if that's something you're interested in, is like not what you're wedded to going forward. In fact, most people's PhD research is not the most important thing that they'll do with their research background and skills as a researcher. I think one of my advisors, Ed, is probably the exception to that rule, and that not even his thesis, I don't actually know what he did for his thesis research, but the side project that he was working on during his thesis is kind of what he's known for, optogenetics. And like, that's pretty unusual. So I'm currently interested in probably working in industry. I'm interested in wearable tech, especially as it relates to neurotech, but because it's such a new field, I'm also kind of waiting to see where things go. But because I also make YouTube videos, I also might work on YouTube full-time for a little bit. We'll see. I think that my YouTube channel has been a great way of having something to do outside of lab that is still aligned with my research, but kind of lets me dig into my own interests academically outside of what I have to do in lab all day. And also kind of cross-pollinates into research, in that in reading about lots of new methods and issues that come up in AI systems, a lot of that information can end up informing the work that I'm doing in lab anyway, or cause me to ask questions that I might not ask otherwise. Oh, I lost my mouse. Okay. And of course, I couldn't do any of this without all of the wonderful mentors that I've had throughout my undergrad, high school, graduate career. In fact, there's people on here that, or there's people who aren't on here that I don't have pictures of because I met them during COVID. But the reason why I bring up this slide is mostly to say that a lot of the stuff that I've been able to do has been because I've had amazing mentors who have supported me throughout my high school research, throughout my undergrad, throughout grad school, and who have helped me find things that interest me and kind of go through the trial and error process of figuring out, you know, what things I want to try, how I can try them, whether or not they're actually things that I want to do, and what to take away from those experiences. But I've also like leveraged their expertise and their network and their connections to help me get to where I am now. Oh, right, this is a gift. This was from our department holiday party where I made him, who's one of our professors, Chris Schaefer, dress up as Santa for the holiday party. Good times. To end up with a little bit of fun, because I feel like people think that you can't have fun in grad school, and you can. I'm super into sports. So I play tennis. I used to fence. I haven't fenced since undergrad, but it's something that I would eventually like to get back to, ideally. More recently, I do CrossFit and a lot of like Olympic weightlifting. I'm also super into science fiction and fantasy books, and as well as creative writing. I actually wanted to do a creative writing minor while I was at Cornell, and I couldn't because one of the required classes conflicted with something I needed to take for my major. And then music, guitar and singing. I was in choir through college and picked up guitar in high school. And travel is on here because that was something that I used to enjoy when we weren't all trapped in our homes during a pandemic, and is something that I would eventually like to enjoy when we're all allowed to go back outside. So in summary, I think my three main things, the big thing that I think I've really leaned into throughout my academic career is just trying out anything that you think you're interested in doing. It helps you figure out what you actually want to do. It can surprise you in a lot of ways. I thought that I was really interested in working at Novartis, and it turned out that I wasn't. And the reasons why I wasn't were not the reasons that I expected, and I wouldn't have known that unless I did it. Especially if you can try things out in a fairly low risk manner, that's usually the better way of doing it. So instead of getting a job at Novartis after you graduate, getting an internship for 3 months is a great way of trying it out, seeing how you like it, and then if you don't like it, you still have to leave at the end of the 12 weeks. For me personally, CS was a field that I didn't really look to that much because I found that the experiences that I'd had in computer science didn't necessarily make me think that I had an aptitude for it, and B, make me think that it was something that could be useful for me. And in hindsight, a lot of that had a lot more to do with the work environment and the mentorships than the actual work itself. So kind of jumping off of the try out everything and use those experiences as information. I would just say to try to break down kind of where your feelings about different experiences come from, because it might not be the work that you don't like or do like, it might be something else. And that's the end of the presentation. So happy to take any questions. I'll stop sharing once I can find my mouse, geez. And you can either unmute yourselves or feel free to drop questions in the chat. There we go.
You can ask questions in the chat too if you want us to read them out as well.
Hi, thank you for giving a wonderful talk. Something I really liked about your presentation was that you really contextualized who you were. You kind of showed us how you came into it. A lot of the time speakers won't do that, and it's kind of unclear, like, how did you get so far into philosophy? How did you get into this topic? That was something I really appreciated. I have a question about what you think about promising consumer neurotech. Do you think something like EEG is a good like a basis for BCI, or do you think that's not going to go anywhere? What lines of research do you think are promising in the long run?
Ooh, that's a hard question. I think consumer neurotech is very interesting right now to me because I feel like it's at this transition point where a lot of existing consumer neurotech has either been kind of specialized use cases that are really more clinical applications than consumer, or like a little pseudoscience-y.
Right.
And I feel like we're starting to get to the point where there's neurotech that either is like in the development process that will eventually make its way out to people in the next couple of years, or might be out to people now that like could actually be useful to people, like to the average person. In terms of interesting areas of research, I mean, like signal analysis and signal decoding is going to be an ongoing problem from like now until forever. So that's definitely an area that I could see continuing to take off in the next couple of years. I think that, I suppose it's a little bit hard to answer the question only because I don't see a lot of like practically useful applications of consumer BCIs at the moment. Like most of the applications I see are either really clinically geared or are like things that wouldn't necessarily be accessible to the general population. So like the equivalent of like an Oculus, things that the average person isn't necessarily going to buy or have particular use for, or constrained to certain systems that only a subset of the population would be interested in using. So yeah, in the consumer world, I think it's a little bit hard to say, just because there's been a lot of like hype-based startups or ideation around consumer neurotech, but I don't think that anyone's like found a product that is actually practically useful to people generally. I actually think that peripherals will be probably more likely to take off, I guess, than anything like CNS based. Peripheral wearables, easier to make, more specific use cases, fewer safety issues that you'd run into. So I could see that being an area, but yeah, past that, definitely a little bit hard to say. And I know someone asked about signal analysis. So when I talk about signal analysis and signal decoding, what I'm essentially referring to is taking different brain signals and turning them into useful information. Whether that be, taking EEG from like the motor cortex and turning that into something for a prosthetic versus taking, and like implanted electrode grid from someone who has epilepsy and using that to predict seizures. Basically taking information from the brain and turning it into something useful. And I think that because a lot of the places where we need that kind of tech are for neurological disorders, it's hard to create consumer grade technologies for that because like the average person doesn't need that. But when it comes to peripheral stuff, you can get kind of into like more fun tech where it's like reading like the muscle twitches from your bicep and using that to do, I don't know, something like you can come up with more like fun products that people might be interested in picking up.
Okay, just one more question. So you it seems like you don't think a lot of the hype surrounding current neurotech is well founded.
Yeah.
How much do you think they're gonna meet their claims? So I'm curious if like it is possible to take an EEG headset and have it have like 20 degrees of freedom, so you can give it 20 commands.
I think that, I think that a lot of, especially startup work, like the whole premise of a startup is that you have an idea and it may or may not work. And a lot of startups fail because things don't work. So I don't necessarily think that it's an over promising issue so much as it is here's this idea, let's chase it. And it may or may not turn out to be an actionable product. In terms of percentages, it's like a little bit hard to say just because you can promise, let's say 20 degrees of freedom and deliver that, but is it in an application that I guess is like something that people would be interested in buying? Becomes my question. And that I think just circles back to the issue of like, what is the use case? What hole in the market are you filling with brain computer interfaces? And I haven't really seen a ton of consumer geared neurotech that like answers that question particularly well.
Okay, so you have like a problem with like the business model side of it.
Yeah, mostly. I think that you can create something that would be safe for use by consumers. I'm mostly curious to see what people create that people are actually interested in having.
I don't know.
I don't know either.
Like if you remember Google Glasses, those just disappear randomly.
Yeah, and Amazon's trying to bring them back and everyone hates them, so.
but at least in my mind, it seems like a good product.
Yeah, I think even when it came back from Amazon, I remember seeing it and like being intrigued and then reading the reviews, and the reviews were like, this isn't as useful as you think it would be. And I think that that's where a lot of ideas around consumer neurotech also fall. Like there's a lot of stuff that's like, this would be cool to have. And then it turns out that you use it and it's like, it's actually just easier for me to do this the way that I did it before.
Anyone else has a question, by the way, feel free to jump in. I don't know. I'm kind of just giving my opinions here now.
Yeah.
Yep. So I had a quick
Okay.
question. So I think I was just going to ask what you thought of the two, I guess, more prominent startups, Neuralink and Kernel.
Yeah, I think I'm less familiar with kernel, so I won't speak to that. Neuralink is hard to have an opinion on. I think it's hard to have an opinion on anything that is essentially stealth research, because I haven't seen as a scientist what I would consider proof of what they do. And that, you know, means peer review, that means third-party replication. That doesn't mean fancy demos on YouTube that look cool, because they do look cool. And if it's working, then that's great. And I wish them the best. But yeah, I think it's hard to have a strong opinion when you can't see the actual science going on behind it. I think that taking their more recent developments at face value, they've done interesting work in combining and improving on existing research. They're a lot of the stuff that I think that they hype up in terms of the implantable devices that they're developing exists already in different forms in academia, and they've taken it and combined it into a smaller package and made it look more appealing to consumers, which is a non-trivial feat. But it's also, there's a bit of a delta between what they actually did from what I can see and like what they're saying that they can do. But yeah, I think that if, you know, they can make good on their claims, then it will be great for a lot of clinical cases. And I suppose I will be curious to see the consumer reaction to it, because optional brain surgery is a non-trivial ask for the average person. So I think that that's the part of their business plan from the consumer perspective that I don't fully understand. Because people like LASIK is something that people are like just now getting their heads around, and like that's a fairly non-invasive technique. And even if they have the sewing machine approach, which is supposed to be faster, supposed to be less invasive, I would still be surprised if enough people to make for a reasonable business model were willing to like undergo optional brain surgery just to try it out. I wouldn't personally.
Okay, I know you said that you did not have enough knowledge to comment about kernel, but going off the point you made that people may not be willing to undergo brain surgery for getting a product like what Neuralink is making, kernel, I think their product is actually like non-invasive. Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I think that would probably, you'd be more likely to get people interested in stuff like that. Non-invasive is usually an easier sell, obviously, because it's not surgery. But yeah,
Okay.
past that.
Well, I guess a more interesting question that I had was like, and I mean, I think you talked about this a bit already, but what do you think of the potential of BCIs to identify and help treat mental illnesses that were previously not difficult to, or that were previously difficult to identify?
Yeah, no, I think that that's a really, really interesting just area of research in general. I don't know that it's BCI is a brain computer interface. I guess I don't know that that work necessarily will fall under BCIs in the sense that a lot of the work that I've seen on it comes from places like the Whitfield Gabrielli lab at MIT, where they're working on fMRI studies to look at correlations between different brain regions to predict essentially childhood likelihood of developing different mental disorders later on. And a lot of that work is super interesting to me. As someone with ADHD, it would have been great for me to have learned that much earlier in life than I did. So I would certainly like to see work like that make it out to the general public, because I think that'd be great. And fMRI is like a relatively easy thing to do to people. So I definitely think that there's a lot of great potential for stuff like that. I think that the issue that neuro imaging, I guess I would say, researchers can sometimes run into, depending on how close you are to the clinic, is just data. Like, how much data do you need before you can kind of make generalizable statements about things? And because of HIPAA and because of the way that healthcare data works in the US, it can be hard to kind of get large enough data sets to make those kinds of broader conclusions that you'd like to make. But I certainly look forward to it. I think that it's a great area of research that will hopefully help a ton of people.
Okay. Last question. So how relevant is machine learning and AI to sort of developing BCIs? I just made sort of the connection that it's really important. So if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of work on things like interpretable machine learning. And I'll say, so machine learning, well, AI is an even more vague term, but machine learning overlaps into a lot of different fields that also have techniques that we kind of call machine learning, but you could debate on whether or not they actually are. And so I think that there's a lot of interesting applications when it comes to signal processing. So there's work on essentially using autoencoders, which are compression models, to make it easier to transmit neural signals wirelessly without dealing with power consumption issues and bandwidth issues, but also reconstruct that data so that it is still meaningful when you get it out on the other end. So I think that's certainly an interesting area of research in terms of actually, interpreting things, creating control systems that regulate whatever brain-computer interface you're using. I definitely see a lot of interesting applications over there. So yeah, I would say when it comes to BCIs, I think machine learning / things like control theory / statistics will definitely be a big part of it. Whether or not the methods like would be called machine learning is something that both machine learning and computational neurosciences and statisticians will yell at each other about over drinks at the bar at most conferences. So I don't think that you necessarily need to call it machine learning or that it necessarily fits into one category. But there's certainly a lot of useful techniques there when it comes to signal processing because you're dealing with very high dimensional data. And ideally, we want to get signals out of it that are both compatible with the hardware that we're trying to develop, but also like interpretable to us as humans.
Okay, and last question. What did you mean by 20 degrees of freedom before?
In terms of EEG, so pulling out 20 different, the example was if you had basically an EEG headset and you wanted to be able to pull out 20 different decisions from it. And that becomes challenging in a lot of ways. That actually circles back to signal processing in terms of like, how do you decode those signals in a meaningful way? How do you attribute them correctly? How do you generalize them usefully? Stuff like that.
Okay, so extracting 20 different decisions from signal data.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Hello.
Yep.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm someone who comes from mainly a philosophy background. I actually graduated last year, but I'm revisiting the Cogsci Club. I used to come pretty much every meeting before. But anyways, I know some computer science stuff too, but what I don't know anything about is biology, and I find this idea of signal processing very interesting. So I wanted to ask a question about it, so I thought of one. I'm just curious if anything has ever been done, like you put on some whatever device is used to get the signal onto an animal, and your goal is to try to predict something about that animal's state of mind. I guess maybe something that's very obviously to be able to confirm whether it's A or B. So you get the signal, you put it in, I guess, some deep learning model, and you get and maybe you're lucky and you are able to get some pretty good precision accuracy in your model. And then from there, you'd save those weights and use them on a human signal, and then try to see, I guess, what the difference is, and maybe if there's, I mean, it might just be that going from animal to animal just completely destroys everything. But I was just wondering if you knew anything about that.
Yeah, so that's called transfer learning. When you pre-train a model on one set of data and then essentially try to apply the information learned from that towards a different problem or a related problem. I haven't delved too deeply into this, so I'd have to actually look at the research to say it definitively, which is basically my way of saying don't quote me. I'm pretty sure I have seen stuff on this. I have to remember what it is. So the example that comes to mind, like off the bat, is sleep staging, using EEG recordings to essentially determine what stage of sleep someone's in. There's a lot of deep learning work on stuff like that. There's also a lot of, this is one of those, like, is it machine learning or is it statistics? So there's a lot of deep learning work on that. There's a lot of people in my lab who work on hidden Markov models or stuff like that, which are statistics, but would also be called machine learning by people in machine learning. And so you can certainly take models like that, train them on, usually for us, it would be rodent data, and then see if you can transfer them to probably humans in that case. What you also can do, which is kind of an interesting new, I guess, approach to machine learning that people have been taking, when I say recent, I mean within the last like 5 years or so, is not exactly do transfer learning. You kind of mentioned this, but take a trained model that has been trained on essentially what you expect normal to look like, and use it to quantify abnormalities. So if you're looking at someone who has some sort of sleep disorder and you're trying to figure out what that might be, you might take a deep learning model that's trained to take EEG and turn it into sleep staging. And you might apply that to someone with abnormal sleep patterns and look at essentially where you see differences, where the model gets things wrong, to better understand what component of sleep that person is having issues with and what the underlying neurological basis of that is. So yeah, there's definitely work in that area. I think there's especially been a lot of interesting work lately on like using machine learning models on, taking pre-trained machine learning models and essentially trying to use them on abnormal data to understand why that data is abnormal. There was actually a paper in Nature probably about 2 months ago that looked at essentially why patients who were dealing with osteopathic pain, so pain related to things like arthritis, were essentially complaining of more pain than doctors were giving pain medication. So why are there these patients? What is this group of patients that seems to have issues with pain in their joints, but some of them are getting pain meds and some of them aren't. And they're complaining at equivalent rates. And what they did was essentially train a model to predict whether or not someone should receive medication based on x-rays of whatever joint they had issues with, and then look at the delta between that and predicting on whether or not the radiologist looking at that image recommended that that person get pain treatment. And this gets into algorithmic fairness and bias research. And essentially what they found was that people from underrepresented groups tended to not be given pain medication as much as people from more prominently represented groups in the US. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But it was an interesting application of kind of something similar to that. Can you take a model that's trained on what we think is normal and use it to identify what might be wrong in abnormal samples? So a very long answer to your question. But yes, on both fronts, there's definitely research on that in that area.
Oh, thank you. That was a very cool answer. And I have one more question. But yeah, that was all very interesting. Yeah, so I imagine a huge problem for people in your field is lack of data. You know, because you can't just scrape it, you need people.
Yep.
I was just wondering what your thoughts are on dealing with that problem, and if you think maybe that going into the future it might be more normal for people to just, I don't know, sign up and get their brain scanned and have it sent to some database.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a problem. I think that there's kind of a HIPAA level problem, which is to say that to get access to protected patient data, you need to enter data exchanges with clinicians, and that has a lot of paperwork and hurdles that you have to deal with. And when I was at Stanford, I had to like encrypt my laptop in order to like use any of the patient data that we had. It's a whole process. And so that's an issue, but then I also can't share that data with other people anymore because the contract that we have is only between our research group and that clinical facility. And so that creates a lot of problems. So yeah, I would definitely say it's a problem. I think that there's been recent work kind of on two sides of this. So one side is the essentially data format problem. A lot of different programs export things in different ways. And so even if you have like 10 data sets of an experiment that you want, they may not all be in a compatible file format. And now you have to go through and like retcon that yourself. And there are software programs that actually fix that for you now, which is great. There are also, depending on the type of data that you're working with, so in particular, if you're working with like MRI data, there are software programs that will anonymize your data for you, which is to say that when you take an MRI of someone, like their face is in it. And so it will basically remove the identifying features of their face. And there's also been research that shows that even if you do anonymize MRI data, you can actually still connect it back to patients. So patient privacy is an ongoing issue in machine learning that has not been fixed at all. And most HIPAA regulations actually don't prevent most of the privacy related issues around machine learning anyway, because the HIPAA privacy rule was written in like 1996 when I was born. So it's a little bit out of date. In terms of how to solve it, I think that one thing that I've seen a lot of recently, which has been great, is just a lot of organization around data sharing. So there are actually like open source neuro websites where you can go and like find people's anonymized databases with like full rundowns of like what each patient, like what patient condition or what experimental condition each patient is under, and what the parameters of the scan were and stuff like that. And so that gives you access to a lot more information that way, which is awesome. I think that the other end of it, I mean, I guess ideally it would be nice if people could like come in and get paid to like get their brain scanned. I know I did that a lot as an undergrad because the Human Ecology School at Cornell, which is like our social sciences college kind of, had a lot of studies involving MRI and fMRI. And so they would like pay you $200 to like sit in MRI and like tell them which purses you liked on the screen above you or whatever. But that kind of data still only gets used by that lab. So it would be cool if we could have people come in and kind of get their brain scanned or find better ways to share patient data. But the privacy issue is like very much unresolved. And I would feel weird about any sort of like expansion of access to patient data that didn't also come with like a lot of advancements in privacy.
Mhm. Cool. Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
There's a lot to it.
Hi, I'm Chloe. I have a question.
Go for it.
What was your favorite collaboration with like YouTubers, or have you done any collaborations with YouTubers?
Oh man. My favorite collaboration with YouTubers. So I guess in terms of videos that I've done that have appeared on other people's channels versus videos that I've done where like I've appeared in other people's videos or like both of us were in the video at the same time. My favorite, like me appearing on someone else's channel. So Tom Scott goes on vacation every year in January, and I actually met him in Boston like 3 years ago now. Wow, that's wild. 2.5 years ago. And there's basically a Slack for like educational creators, and so he like posts in the Slack and he's like, oh, I'm gonna like be in Boston, anyone want to get coffee? And I wasn't into science YouTube before starting a channel, so like I had no idea who this guy was and I didn't look him up. So we got coffee and like hung out, and then after the fact I looked him up and was like, oh, this guy has like 2 million subscribers, that's crazy. So basically he emailed me. We've hung out a couple times over the last couple of years, and he emailed me last fall interested in having me do a deep fake video for him. And so for one of his January guest videos, I ended up making a deep fake of him for his channel. So that was probably the most fun time I've appeared on someone else's channel. In terms of the most fun like joint video I've done with someone, it would actually probably be I worked with Simon Clark on a video last fall, and he wanted to create an algorithm to like, so he plays this game called Warhammer, which I like don't get, and involves like figurines, and I don't get it at all. But he wanted to create an algorithm to like beat him in Warhammer, like play Warhammer against him. And so I helped him do that, and that was just a lot of fun because like we're both very sarcastic, so like half of it was just us like making glib comments back and forth and me critiquing his code and stuff like that. So it was a lot of fun. So yeah, those would probably be the two that come to mind.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one last question if anyone wants to ask. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Jordan. This was great. Like, we had so much fun, and this was such an engaging discussion about AI and your research journey. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. And yeah, we hope you have
Yeah,
a
no
good
problem.
day.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Before you guys leave the rest of the club, I just wanted to put a quick survey out for people who are going to, who are, who usually participate. We were thinking of having a trivia night next week, but we're not sure if a lot of people will come because of finals / midterms, exam season, etc. So for those who are interested in a meeting next week, please just fill out the poll. I just posted it in the chat. If you'd like to see a trivia night next week, if you'd like to see a movie night, we'd be watching Wall-E. A game night, we'd be playing Scribblia, if you know what that is. It's basically like this is like Pictionary, but you draw the picture. Oh no, that is Pictionary. It's online Pictionary, or there you just vote for no meeting. It's really up to you guys. I know it's really hard with finals coming up. Trust me, I'm taking Orgo, so I'm suffering. But yeah, just help us out, fill that out, and we'll see you guys soon.
Good luck for finals.
Yeah, good luck.